Hello, everybody. Welcome to their new podcast titled Marshall County Memoirs, where we look into the history of Marshall County through events and people's perspectives. My name is Tanner Skim. I'm the archivist at the Moundsville Marshall County Public Library.
I'm Trent Dayton. I am the AmeriCorps member with the Marshall County Historical Society.
I am Joseph A. Joey Tellitocci. I am the business office manager of the Moundsville Marshall County Public Library from Benwood, West Virginia.
Joey is a local historian and genealogist from Benwood, and he's been very interested in the Benwood Mine Disaster of 1924 for quite some time. Both Joey and his father, Joseph Tellitocci Jr., contributed their time to research information about the Benwood Mine Disaster, as well as the dedication of a monument for those who lost their lives. All right, Joey, so first question is give us a summary of the disaster. Tell us the situation, when did it occur, what was the cause?
The Benwood Mine Disaster, it occurred 101 years ago on Monday, April 28th, 1924. 20 days from now, it'll be the 101st anniversary. And what happened was, the Benwood Mine, it was the mine that supplied coal to the Wheeling Steel Corporation steel mill in Benwood. And that morning, it exploded, and approximately 7:05 a.m. that morning, like a half hour after the last of the miners had entered the mine. It remains the third worst coal mining disaster in West Virginia history. And what happened was, like I said, the miners, I think the early shift got in about 6:30 a.m. or so, approximately 7:05 a.m. There was an explosion. There was two explosions, which occurred in rapid succession. The first was in a pocket of methane gas that builds up in the coal mine and has to be monitored or else things like this happen. Back in those days, they brought in canaries. If the canary went in and died, they knew there was an accumulation of gas. If the canary came out alive, it was safe for the miners to go in. Of course, nowadays we have much more advanced methods to monitor that. Although, sadly, there are still mine disasters occurring throughout the country. And just 15 years ago in West Virginia, there was a mine disaster at the Upper Big Branch Mine. But anyway, back in 1924, that's how they had to monitor that. So after the methane gas explosion, that explosion raised coal dust, which was ignited by either a rail spark, lighted match, lantern flame, or some other source. That caused the second, more deadly explosion, which carried it up to the workings of all of the entire mine. Back in those days, there weren't a lot of safety measures, and the mine was very dry and dusty since it wasn't properly ventilated. So yeah, that's basically what happened that morning. Very tragic.
So how many people died? Were there any causes of death that were not the explosion or like aftermath?
Well, there was 119 victims of coal miners, men and boys, as young as 16 years old to men in their 60s, probably just getting ready to retire. The majority of the men were single and in their 20s and 30s, although there were a lot of married men with children, so it varies. 110 of the 119 coal miners were European immigrants of the early 1900s, and they came to Benwood and the surrounding areas of Boggs Run, Browns Run, South Wheeling. There was actually some miners that lived here in Moundsville and came up to work in the Benwood steel mill in the mine. This area at the time, there was an abundance of jobs in coal industry, the steel industry, the railroad. What would often happen is, immigrants, like their friends or family would come over here and they would write for them and say, hey, there's job openings, and then they'd be on the next ship bound for America. Of course, sadly, they came here to better their lives than what they were in Europe. My family were tenant farmers, so everything they farmed, they gave to the government. They kind of wanted to get out of that. It was just on the brink of World War I, so they escaped Hungary before that. Sadly, they came here and then things like this happened. They came here for the American dream, so to speak, but sadly it always didn't work out that way. Of the 119 miners, only 9 of them were actually born here in the United States. So the whole mine was filled with immigrants from Poland, Italy, Greece, Hungary, Croatia, Serbia, Russia, Ukraine, Slovenia, Slovakia, Wales, Scotland, and England. That's the ethnicities of the miners who were killed that day. With an explosion of that magnitude, they were either burned to death by the fire from the explosion, they suffocated due to the deadly gases that built up in the mine after the explosion, which is called afterdamp. Of course, the mine collapsed. Several were crushed by the falling debris caused by the explosion. The victims were predominantly of the Roman Catholic faith, and they were parishioners of St. John Parish in Benwood, which is my lifelong parish and maternal family church. The former St. Ladislaus Parish, which closed in 1995, which was known as the Polish Church in South Wheeling because it was founded by Polish immigrants. 71 of the 119 victims were buried in Mount Calvary Cemetery in Wheeling, West Virginia, which is owned and operated by the Diocese of Wheeling-Charleston. So that's our Catholic cemetery here in the area. Because of the number of miners that were killed from St. John's, our priest at the time, Father Shonen, he was the pastor of St. John's, he was forced to conduct mass funerals. There was upwards to like 5-10 miners buried from the same funeral mass, and then on out to Mount Calvary with the graveside committal service. The majority of the miners, there's a section in Mount Calvary, section 12, that's where the majority of them are buried.
That's interesting. It's fascinating to see a small town like Benwood have such a variety of immigrants, along with different churches, and how it became so diverse.
Back then, it was like a melting pot. I mean, these immigrants were coming over here in droves. Of course, this was the third wave of immigration through Ellis Island, Boston, Philadelphia. They were just pouring in, and then coming down by rail to Benwood, Boggs Run, where my family settled, which was later annexed to Benwood. These men, like I said, they wanted to escape the oppression from their home countries, which were starting to become communist ruled. Here, they were free to pursue other things. Because of the abundance of the jobs here, this was a perfect place for them to come, settle, raise their families. Like I said, the majority were Catholic. In Wheeling alone, there was 13 to 14 Catholic parishes. Every town had its own Catholic parish. They kind of stuck together and helped each other out. And not only in their own communities, but they befriended people of other ethnicities, quote, natives that were already here, that were also immigrants, but much earlier. There was just like that sense of community back then.
The next question we have is, how did the civilians respond to the news? And what happened in that situation where the town heard the explosion probably, and they probably saw all the commotion, and how did they react?
Obviously, this is before computers, social media, or whatever. From what I'm told, the explosion was felt miles away and heard. The people that lived near the main entrance, which was in the old mill, which is actually still there, it's no longer Wheeling Steel, that particular workings, the Benwood Works closed in like 1982, but Wheeling Steel continued on like for 20 some years or so after that. What you see there is the actual mill. The entrance, I've never been able to determine exactly where it was. The older people in Benwood would try to explain to me where it was. The people that lived closest to there, of course, saw and heard the explosion. This mine was pretty big mine. It traveled all the way out to Boggs Run, Browns Run, through under center Benwood. Recently, Consul was who owned the mine at the time. There's still an active coal mine that was able to go into those workings, find things left from that day. Very eerie in a sense, but also very interesting that stuff was still there. It was mass chaos, really, because once word of mouth reached the families, the women and children, they rushed hysterically to the scene, screaming and crying, asking for word of their loved ones. Most of them didn't speak English, so it was hard to communicate with them. Not only the wives and the children, but a lot of these men were singles. They had their parents, if they had their parents here, their relatives, brothers, sisters, fathers, mothers. They all kept like a constant vigil at the mine entrance to wait for word to see if there were any survivors. The other entrance to the mine was at an air shaft out Browns Run. I'm actually from Boggs Run, the mouth of Boggs Run. Further out Boggs Run, Browns Run flows into Boggs Run, and that's where the air shaft was. They kept vigil there. That day, there was a heavy, drenching rain that fell. In a sense, it kind of mimicked their tears there. Very, very tragic, sad day in Benwood. The worst thing that's ever happened in our little city, which I think nowadays there's maybe 1,200 people, approximately. But back then, the population was much larger. You had all these immigrant families that came here and working in the steel mills and the coal mines. Of course, with any kind of tragedy like this, there's always curious onlookers. Besides the family and the friends, they also descended upon the scene. It got so to where they had to actually put up barricades to keep them back because people wanted to run into the mine, find my husband, find my son, my brother. There was a police presence, and that's what the women, they especially, the grieving widows, they tried to bypass those barricades and run to other parts of the mill looking for another way into the mine. Sadly, one of the widows was just so distraught she tried to drown herself in the Ohio River, but luckily people saw her and pulled her out of the water, and she survived. Another lady by the name of Caroline Olinsky Melcher, age 68, she was one of the onlookers, and she was killed by a speeding truck that was rushing supplies to the mine. So it was just mass and utter hysteria, chaos. They said people walked through the streets of Benwood just crying. It's nothing like any of us have ever experienced. So yeah. There were no survivors of this explosion. All
No.
119 men perished in the mine. When they went to work, they had like a badge with a number, and they were checked in by that. That's how they knew they showed up for work. The loaders, they got paid by the amount of coal that they actually mined. So back in those days, it was not uncommon for the people to turn a blind eye if they wanted to bring a relative or their own child in to help them mine the coal, because the more coal they mined, the more they got paid. 119 death certificates were issued. Could there have been other people in that mine? Possibly. They were probably afraid to come forward because they didn't want the mine bosses and the steel mill bosses to find out. Like I said, the people that checked them in sometimes turned a blind eye, but I don't know if that was okay with the people that actually ran the bosses and things. And that's something, sadly, we'll never know. I believe there probably are still remains of the miners down in the mine. They probably, especially the ones that got killed by the blast. But there were 119 burials. Like I said, the majority was out at Mount Calvary, then down the street at Greenwood at the Protestant cemetery. And there was actually a plot of land that Wheeling Steel purchased for the men they couldn't identify. Of course, this is before DNA testing, and I'm sure like fingerprinting was in its infancy, and you have to consider the mangled conditions of some of the bodies. Like process of elimination, I'm told one guy was identified by his wedding ring. There was an inscription on his wedding ring, and that's how they knew it was him. And actually, the plot of land that was in Greenwood Cemetery that was purchased for this, for the temporary interment until they determined who was who, that's still unpurchased as of today. I've actually been there. Like I said, it's just nothing that any of us alive today in this area, of course, has ever experienced.
So, what were the recovery efforts like? Was there any obstacles that rescue teams had to face? How'd that go?
Many, many obstacles. So, like I said, an explosion like this that causes these poisonous gases to develop. So the men in the mine, of course, the ones that weren't crushed, the ones that weren't burned to death, they succumbed to suffocation from the afterdamp. Now, of course, now you've got other men, coal miners from other coal mines in the area who came. At first, it started out as a rescue because they just didn't know what they were going to encounter. So they're going into this mine, and there's still the presence of afterdamp. The miners didn't have gas masks, but I've seen a picture of men actually going into the mine with the masks. So there was that, and then of course there was the mine had collapsed due to the explosion. The roof collapsed, the haulage ways were destroyed. Rescue teams had to dig through the fallen rock and debris and crawl through small spaces to get to larger areas. And that just, reading that, I'm claustrophobic, so I can't even imagine what that was like for them. And of course they're burrowing through these small holes and such, and the things that they're going to encounter are just horrific. After they got so far back into the mine via the main entry, all rescue recovery efforts had to be shifted to the air shaft at Brown's Run because what they found was there was a major blockage of the main entrance because it had completely collapsed and they just could not get through the fallen rock, slate, and debris. The men worked around the clock in relay teams of every 750 feet. And rescue teams came from the nearby Hitchman mine in Benwood, which 18 years later, there was a mine disaster. In that mine, 5 men were killed, but there were survivors. They came to help down here in Glendale. There was a mine. Those miners came to help over in Belair, Bridgeport, Ohio, Steubenville, as far away as from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Cincinnati, Ohio, and Williamson, West Virginia, which is in the southern part of the state. Oh. So once, like I said, once the word got out, these men and women, they wanted to do what they could to help, which is a testament to the human spirit. They all came and helped and such, because sadly, 110 of the 119 are immigrants. Some of the people that ran the company kind of just was like, okay, well, they're dead, so the next batch is coming over on Ellis Island. We'll just replace it with them, which was terrible. But it goes to show there are actually people that did care and were concerned about these men. These men were fathers, they were husbands, they were sons. Doctors and nurses from the Wheeling chapter of the American Red Cross and Wheeling came to the scene. Actually, 2 men were found alive in the air shaft. The rescue teams tried to revive them, but they actually died before they were brought to the surface. During the first few days, there was actually some hope that they were going to find miners who may have trapped themselves in the workings and didn't get the fire from the blast or crushed, or somehow a lot of the miners were found, I'm told, with pieces of clothing tied around their faces, their noses and mouths to try to prevent the suffocation, but sadly that wasn't enough to protect them. After a while, though, it was just, they knew that they weren't going to find anybody alive. They had to go into recovery mode, switch from rescue to recovery. There was a temporary morgue set up at the Cooey Bents building, And then back then there was a club in Benwood called the Blue Ribbon that also served as a temporary morgue where they would bring the bodies out, lay them out for their family or whomever to identify them. Also at the air shaft, once they brought the bodies out, there was a temporary morgue established out there too, like they made a tent or something. I do have some photographs of that. And also they were laid out in a field basically. Just gruesome just to even think about that. I've lived in Benwood my whole life. I've traveled these areas and things, and just to try to envision that going on 101 years ago, it's just mind-blowing. It took up to like 8 men to carry one body. Of course, after a few days, with not being embalmed, there was this overpowering stench of decay. So not only are they having to work through debris, all these after damp could still be present. They had to smell the stench of these decaying bodies. The men that actually came and aided in this effort, they are awarded with a fob. I have one in my personal collection, and I know Tanner has one in his archives, and then at the Benwood McMecken Library, we have one displayed on the wall in the little office. And it says, for your efforts. I'm paraphrasing, I don't have it in front of me, but it's like, for your efforts in aiding for the Benwood Mine Disaster, April 28th, 1924. Once the men were brought out, physicians disinfected them. They tried to start the embalming process. The mine disaster happened on a Monday. By Friday, they had discovered 76 bodies. And the last of the bodies, now this varies. I have May 6th here in my notes, but I think there was actually one man that wasn't found until like May 16th or so. Between the span of like May 5th and 15th, 16th is when the last they know was brought out. The burial process began. Fathers and sons, there's 3 pairs killed, pairs of brothers, several pairs of brothers, and cousins. You lose your husband, your son, multiple tragedies for some of these families. Like I said, just it's hard to describe not having witnessed it. Luckily, we do have a lot of good accounts that were published in the newspaper, and I actually met some people in my lifetime that were still alive and were children, so I got first-hand account of some of the things.
How did the city respond to this?
I don't know specifically what the city of Benwood may have done. I'm sure they aided in his efforts as much as they could. I think it was probably a group effort between the city of Benwood, Wheeling Steel Corporation. There was actually a bank in Benwood at that time called the Bank of Benwood. And what they did was they established a relief fund for the widows and children of the miners. 2 employees of the bank, by the last names of Leach and Ward, embezzled the fund. The women, the widows, and the children never received that money. I know that they did receive other forms of compensation, probably from Wheeling Steel itself. With any tragedy, you see the best of humanity and you see the worst of humanity. And you can even see that in things that we've experienced. 9/11, I was 22 years old, saw that play out. With things like that, you see people that really step up and care and want to help. And then you see people like this who embezzled the money that was supposed to go for people that were left destitute without their only source of income. They actually did both receive 10-year prison sentences down here at the Moundsville Pen. I'm not sure what became of them after they served their sentence. But there was also another story that I came across during my research. 2 years later, in 1926, a widow with 8 children posed as a mine widow to try to receive compensation. But her husband had actually died in 1918. He was never a coal miner. He died 6 years before the mine disaster ever took place. You had things like that going on, and the people that deserved the compensation didn't get it, or as much as they should have.
Unfortunate.
Was there an impact on other mining companies? What was just the overall aftermath of the disaster?
It led to some additional safety measures in the mine that weren't taken. Like I said, back then, you put your fate in the hands of a canary, whether or not it came out alive or not. I mean, that still was probably the case up until more advanced technological things happened. But one of the things that the mine was very, as I mentioned at the beginning, it was very dry, dusty. So it led to something called rock sprinkling, to where they would try to alleviate the dust. Because, you're down there, they're mining the mine, there's all this coal dust and everything. So it led to things called rock dusting. Also, it led to miners carrying the self-rescuer SCSR gas masks. It's speculated that maybe if the miners would have had those on hand, some of them could have survived. We'll never know for sure, but I'm sure the masks weren't as sophisticated as they are today. Some good things came out of it in terms of like safety measures that were now taken by other local mines and on a national level.
That's good to hear that they started to think more about that, because if they thought about it before, yes, there could have been some survivors. What made you interested in researching this disaster? Tell us why.
Well, I am actually the great-grandson of one of the victims. And the 1924 Benwood Mine Disaster affected both sides of my family, both my mom's and my dad's side. On my mom's side, it was my great-grandfather, Hungarian immigrant István Varga, Stephen here in the United States. István is the Hungarian form of Stephen. He was the father of my late maternal grandmother, Julia Teresa Varga Molnar. She lived from June 23rd, 1918 to November 1st, 1992. She died when I was 13. Her father was killed. Great-grandfather Varga had come from Sani, Hungary in 1914 with his wife, my grandmother's mother, Rosalia Varga. It's funny, my great-grandmother's maiden name was Varga and she married a Varga. No relation. They married in 1913 in their native village of Sani. But then when they came through Ellis Island, they started going by Vargo. They just changed the A to an O. They settled in Boggs Run with my maternal grandfather's parents, who were also Hungarian immigrants. Antal Molnar, Anthony, here in the United States. He was from Zani, Hungary, my great-grandfather. So he might have known the Vargas, I'm not sure. And then his wife, Erzsébet Kovács Molnar, she was from Kossuth, Hungary, about 30 minutes away from Zani. They actually met here. They both resided in a boarding house at the mouth of Boggs Run, which became my family home. They married at St. John in 1909 and had 2 sons, the youngest son being my grandfather. They started out as boarders in this house and they ran it as a boarding house after they were married and had their family. The Vargos lived in the downstairs apartments that were in the basement at the time. And the Molnars lived on the first floor, and then the other parts of the house were sectioned off into apartments. So they lived there from 1914 to March 1923 is the date of the deed. They moved up the street to 56 Roosevelt. Well, it wasn't 56 Roosevelt then until the annexation in 1944. It was a small 4-room house that actually is still there. Sadly, the Molnar homestead burned to the ground on May 22nd, 2011, after being my family home for like over 100 years due to an arson fire. The house that the Vargo family moved to, so my great-grandfather actually achieved being a homeowner the year before he died. They bought that house. So my grandmother would have been around 5 because she would have been born to the Molnar homestead and then she would have moved up the street. They had had 6 children. The day of the explosion, 4 children were still alive. The oldest brother, Louis, and Stephen. And then my grandmother, Julia, she was 2 months shy of her 6th birthday, the day her father was killed. And then Teresa, who was a baby at the time. 3 years prior to this, in 1921, the Vargos had lost an infant daughter who was also named Teresa. After she died, they named the next daughter Teresa. And then my great-grandmother was actually 2.5 months pregnant with their 6th child, Rose, who went by Rosie. And she was born on November 10th, 1924. My great-grandfather was 36 years old the day he was killed. He actually considered not going to work that day. He was sick. And he just had this odd feeling. This is a family story that was passed down by my grandmother. Back then, there were no sick days. If he didn't go to work, the family starves. He forced himself to go, and then 30 minutes later, he was dead. He would have been 37 years old on August 31st of 1924. I can't even imagine what my great-grandmother Rose, here she is, she lost her husband, she's pregnant with her 6th child, she's got 4 other children, ranging in age from 10 to 1 to take care of. I just can't even imagine what was going through her mind. But as I spoke of earlier, she was lucky she had her maternal aunt here, Agnes Langel, and her family. Of all the miners that were killed in the Benwood Mine Disaster, 3 of them were Hungarian, one of them being my great-grandfather and then his 2 good friends, Sándor Horváth and Ignác Orbán. Ignác Orbán was actually my Grandma Julie's godfather. They are buried in Mount Calvary Cemetery, but not in Section 12. The other miners, they're buried in Section 9, and they're all side by side. I visit the graves frequently. That's kind of my role in the family. I'm the carer of the family graves. I take them flowers. I go out for their anniversaries and such, birthdays, death anniversaries. A little bit more about my great-grandfather Vargo. As I mentioned, my grandma Julia Varga Molnar, she was 2 months shy of her 6th birthday. She would have been 6 on June 23rd of 1924. But she actually remembered her father's wake. Back then, they didn't use funeral homes like we do today. They actually just brought the body to the living room of the house or the parlor, and that's where they were laid out. And the neighbors and the families came and paid their respects at the family home. So she remembered that, and she actually remembered seeing him in the casket. And we always assumed that he was probably one of the victims of the afterdamp, because why would they let the family view the body if he was mangled? I remember she did tell me that he had some burns. They probably weren't as severe as some of the other men. From the family home in Boggs Run, he was taken to St. John Church in Center Benwood, which was our family church. His funeral was held along with the 2 Hungarian miners and then 2 of the Italian immigrant brothers. So there was 5 buried that day. And this was on May 2nd, 1924. Then they were taken onto Mount Calvary. where there was a committal service. And like I said, they are buried in Section 9. A year later, my great-grandmother Rose remarried to Hungarian immigrant István Horváth, also known as Stephen, on October 17, 1925 at St. John Roman Catholic Church in Benwood. And they had 2 more children, Alex Horváth, who went by Abe, and Elizabeth Horváth, who we called Erzsi, because the Hungarian form of Elizabeth is Erzsébet, so that's where Erzsi comes from. Had it not been for the explosion, Uncle Abe and Erzsi would never have existed. My great-grandparents, they were on their 6th child. They probably would have just kept on having more children. Who knows how many they would end up having. My grandmother and grandfather would have still married, had my mother. However, on my dad's side, this is the impact it had with that. And the reason that I'm actually sitting here talking to you guys today. My paternal grandfather, Joseph Tellitocci Sr., he was born October 19th, 1927 in Blair, Ohio, died June 24th, 1993 when I was 14. His mother, my great-grandmother, Italian immigrant Maria Olivieri from Ascoli Piceno in the March, Italy. Her first husband was one of the Benwood Mine Disaster victims. His name was Pasquale Fana. He was age 42 at the time he was killed. He was from Città Sant'Angelo in Pescara, Abruzzo, Italy. He immigrated to the United States in 1904, lived in New Jersey for a while, came to Blair, Ohio about 1907. He actually went back to his native village around 1911, married his first wife, Donina Carota, in Città Sant'Angelo, brought her back over. They had a son in Blair once he resettled in Blair named Vincent Fana. Both Donina and Vincent died of tuberculosis 2 months apart from each other. Vincent died May 25th, 1914. Donina died in Wheeling Hospital on July 24th, 1914. This left Pasquale, a widower, at about 35 at that time. He wanted another wife, and he wanted an Italian wife like himself. There were people in Blair who actually helped facilitate a lot of the immigrations of the Italian immigrants that settled in Blair and actually even right across the river in Benwood. Through that, they found my great-grandmother over in Italy who was willing to come over and be his wife. She came over in September 1916. She was the one great-grandparent of mine that didn't come through Ellis Island. She actually came through Boston. While she was on the ship, she turned 25 years old. Her and Pasquale met. They married at St. John Catholic Church in Blair. They had 5 children together. Their firstborn was named Donina after his first wife. She died in infancy. And then they had Rita, Virginia, son Armand. Uncle Armand was killed in World War II at the age of 23 in France, which is where he rests because his wife decided to leave him over there buried in an American cemetery in France. And then their youngest child together was my great-aunt Edith. Ida, an Italian. She actually just died last year at the age of 100. She was in her 101st year. But she was only 6 months old when her father was killed. After Pasquale's killed, he was buried from St. John Roman Catholic Church in Blair on May 4th, 1924, and he's buried in Mount Calvary Cemetery in Blair. So that's the Catholic cemetery in Belmont County, Ohio. After that, she remarried to my great-grandfather, Italian immigrant Luigi Tellitocci. That's how my name's pronounced in Italy. He was from Bargiano in L'Agola, Abruzzo, Italy, and he'd come over in 1910. He was a coal miner. Luckily, he didn't work for the Benwood Mine. He worked for Railroad River No. 6 mine in Belmont County. I often wondered if him and my great-grandfather Molnar, who was also a coal miner, worked for Clean Coal Company in Wheeling, if they might have been 2 of the miners that helped with the recovery and rescue efforts. I don't have any proof of that, but I'd like to think that's what a lot of the miners in the surrounding areas they had to do, is they came and tried to help these men. So after they married, they had my great-uncle Columbus, my grandfather Joseph, and then my great-uncle Alfred. So had Pasquale Fana, if he would have lived and never died in the mine explosion, my whole line wouldn't exist. My grandfather wouldn't have been born, which means he would have never married my grandma Evelyn. My father would have never been born, none of my father's siblings. My dad and mom would have never married. Me and my late sister and my brother Travis would never have been born, and Travis's children, my nephews Tyler and Hudson, wouldn't be born. I know a lot of families that actually a whole other line came out of. The widows remarried. They had additional children. Not only myself, there's a lot of people in Benwood, Wheeling, in this area that, like, if this hadn't happened, they would never existed. My interest in family history and genealogy started as young as like 10 years old. My grandma Mona, at that time, when the family homestead was at the bottom of the street, we lived about a couple houses up from it. She was a diabetic, so she lost a leg and a foot to diabetes, so my mom took her in. She lived with us the last 7 years of her life. And we just always talked about the past. We went down and retrieved the old photos that were still in the homestead, brought those up one day. And we would just go through them. Who's this, Grandma? And she would tell me about life in Boggs Run and the Benwood Mine Disaster. So it's something I've always been aware of. It wasn't until I got older that I realized, well, a lot of these men, their names are unrecognizable. But my passion for all this, like I said, I had a lot to absorb because Grandma died when I was 13. And my other grandma, Evelyn Fisher Tellitocci, my paternal grandmother who passed away 4 years ago, she also got me interested in family history because she also had all the family photographs, kept all the newspaper clippings. When I was 16, a sophomore at Bishop Donahue High School, we had to do our first detailed family tree, and I really enjoyed that. When I was in college, around the summer of 2000, I just sat down at my computer and just wrote everything down that anyone had ever told me. After I graduated from Wheeling Jesuit University in 2001, that's when I started all my in-depth research of the family. All four sides, Tellitocci, Fisher, Monar, Vargo. I compiled family histories, all the other branches that shoot out from my main family. In the early 2000s, around like 2005, 6, 7, 8, somewhere around there, I started delving more into the Benwood Mine Disaster. There's all these publications, articles at the time that actually listed men that never were killed. There was just all this misreporting. The names were unrecognizable. They just put it down how it sounded to them. I'm 6/8 immigrant. 4 of my great-grandparents on the maternal side from Hungary, 2 from Italy on my dad's side. This isn't right. These men deserve to be properly recognized. I just kind of delved into that and tried to correct as many of them as I possibly could. I am a very passionate genealogist. As of last night, I have 26,041 people in my family tree on Ancestry, which I'm not related to all of them, but through marriages, this one marries this one marries this one. My whole parish is basically in there. Most of Benwood, McMecken, prominent families in Wheeling. You just keep going and going. It's an addiction, really. And the genealogy bug bites you. It just, And that's how I spend a lot of my free time. That's my reason for actually getting involved in all this.
Yeah, you're pretty passionate. So to anyone that doesn't know, there's actually a highway marker by the vicinity of the disaster, as well as a memorial, and you were involved in that. First of all, how can people find this? Where exactly is it? What was the timeline?
The 85th anniversary of the disaster was in 2009. With my research, I approached the Wheeling News Register and Intelligencer and said, hey, would you publish something on the Benwood Mine Disaster? Because they would do that for the 70th anniversary and such. So it was the 85th, every 5 years. And they did. They graciously did. And they ran the story. That's kind of how the historical highway marker became about, because there never was one before that. Like you said, it's in the vicinity of the mill yard down in Center Benwood, coming up into South Benwood. Once my list was published, that led to a lot of other good things. I have a friend, Linda Cunningham Fluharty, dear friend of mine, lives in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She maintains the Marshall County, West Virginia Gen Web website, along with some other websites in this area still. I reached out to her. That's the first time I'd ever talked to her, met her. And she's originally from Boggs Run, but further out from where I'm from. She was gone from Boggs Run before I even was alive, I think. She published my list on her website, which she kept the old list, but she published mine too. So that got me kind of exposure with that. Sean Duffy, who's the program coordinator at the Ohio County Public Library, he approached me in April of 2011 to do a lunch with books on the Benwood Mine Disaster. So I did that. That led to about 9 other public speaking engagements. From April of 2011 to March 2023, I gave about 10 of them at local organizations. One of them here at the Moundsville Marshall County Public Library. I was not yet working here. Susan Riley and Catherine Ferriock reached out to me, asked me if I'd come do a presentation. I ended up doing 2 here. But that's kind of around the time when our memorial, we decided, hey, we're going to go for the memorial. There'd never been a memorial for these men, the victims of this horrible tragedy. In August 2011 is when this all kind of, the memorial, Benwood Mine Disaster Memorial Committee was born. And I continued giving my public presentations. Sean graciously featured the story of my whole family in the Benwood Mine Disaster in his Wheeling Family Volume 2, More Immigrants, Migrants, and Neighborhoods book that he published in 2012. There was other Marshall County residents that were interested in helping us. I served as the co-chairperson, historian, and treasurer. My late father served as the project coordinator. Then we had Susan Riley, Catherine Ferriock, who actually designed the monuments. The late Betty Key, who passed away in 2020. Betty was actually alive on the day of the Benwood Mine Disaster. She was in her 3rd year. That was kind of neat. Ed Sherman, John Mercer, and J.R. Cross. So for 3 years, we raised funds for a permanent memorial in Benwood. The land was donated to us by Consul Cole in Benwood. I would say, approximately off the top of my head, We raised over $100,000 in donations, money, materials, and labor. My father oversaw all aspects of construction. He maintained the site, whatnot. The designs were submitted, the stone was done, brought to Boggs Run, erected there, and then we were finally ready to formally dedicate it on September 27th, 2014. The memorial site is located on Boggs Run Road, Roosevelt Avenue, at the mouth of Boggs Run in Benwood, Marshall County, West Virginia. I mentioned the Hitchman Mine Disaster earlier. Because there were 2 coal mining disasters in the little city of Benwood, we have a stone for the 5 victims of the Hitchman Mine as well. It was also dedicated that day. 2 years later, my dad, through private donation, he designed and we erected a donor stone of all the major donors, the names of the committee members. We added bollards to the driveway. A mural was painted, but that was actually there on the day of the dedication. And we added some benches for people to sit on. And sadly, my dad unexpectedly died on March 15th, 2018 at the age of 65, suffering a cardiac event while helping friends cut down trees. And like I said, he devoted all his time. The memorial is actually catty corner from where we live. So he was down there all the time. He took care of the grass cutting, all the upkeep. So we had some money left over in the fund, and, I approached the committee members. We decided to erect a memorial stone for my dad at the memorial site. I also want to mention the Marshall County Historical Society and their help to us, because they allowed us to use their 501c3 status, which allowed every donation of money to be tax exempt. And that's part of what I did as treasurer, is every time I received a donation, I'd send a letter to the donor with the tax ID number. It was through them that we were able to accomplish that, so I'm very appreciative for that. Luckily, now there is a permanent memorial for all 119 victims of the 1924 mine disaster, as well as the Hitchman mine disaster. One of my proudest accomplishments.
You should definitely be proud of that, because a lot of work, a lot of dedication, and just a lot of effort.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of hard to find that nowadays. But we know that last year, 2024, was the 100th anniversary of the mine disaster. And we would like to know what you did for that commemoration.
In order to commemorate the 100th anniversary, I wrote an article about the Benwood Mine Disaster and about a summary of what happened that day and the impact that it had on my family, which I just discussed. They published that in the Life section in their Saturday-Sunday edition in the Life section on April 27th, 2024. Sean and Duffy once again reached out to me to do a lunch with books on the disaster, and we did a much different thing than what I had done in 2011. It focused on the men and the boys that were killed. We profiled each one of them. There was a slide for each one, contained a photograph if we had it, their age, what they did in the mine. It was a very somber, very beautiful memorial. Sean did the PowerPoint. It was just absolutely spectacular. And we did that at Lunch with Books at Ohio County Library on April 23rd. The next evening, here at Moundsville Marshall County Public Library, we did the same program on April 24th. I was very excited because my mother, her sister, her brother, her brother-in-law, her best friend, and her best friend's daughter, and another good family friend all attended. My mom's maternal first cousin had attended my Lunch with Books presentation the day before, because that was also her grandfather that was killed. So it was a very nice evening. Several of my coworkers were there. Susan is my boss, and of course a former committee member was there. Then on the actual day of the anniversary, on April 28th, 2024, I'm a lifelong member, as I mentioned, of St. John Roman Catholic Church in Benwood, which is where many of the miners were parishioners. We had the mass intention for the miners that day. My mother and I carried up the gifts at the offertory. Right after the mass, we had a memorial ceremony that was organized by the West Virginia AFL-CIO, the Marshall Wetzel Tyler Central Labor Council. The featured speaker for the event was Cecil Roberts, who's actually the president of the United Mine Workers of America. He gave a wonderful speech, very uplifting. This was held across the street from St. John Church in our fellowship hall. I was invited to participate in this by Arthur Sonny Oakland. He's the president of the Marshall Wetzel Tyler Labor Council. His daughter, Catherine Oakland Fulmer, and I were classmates at Bishop Donahue, members of the class in 1997. Very appreciative of Sonny to reach out to me and include me. And then I'm known for my Facebook tributes. Anytime there's a birthday or death anniversary, so I did a tribute on my Facebook for the 100th anniversary. And then Mount Calvary Cemetery, which is where 6 generations of both sides of my family are buried, and where 71 of the miners are buried. John Eric Jalot, he's the archivist at the Diocese of Wheeling Charleston, and a friend of mine. They hosted a memorial service in the chapel of Mount Calvary Cemetery, and then we processed up to Section 12, where the majority of the miners are buried. The bishop of the diocese, Mark Brennan, was there. Also, Deacon Doug Brading, who's the sexton of Mount Calvary Cemetery, and his wife, Becky Brading, the secretary at Mount Calvary. They were also there. They all wanted me to be a part of this, and I'm very appreciative that they included me. And then later on that evening, the labor union had placed a wreath at the memorial, which we left there for a year. And then later on that evening, after all was said and done, my mom and I just walked across the street from our house and just kind of like quietly reflected on everything that we'd done to commemorate, everything that Dad had done. Of course, there's his memorial stone, so it's emotional. I'm actually had to fight back tears a couple times today, but it's still kind of difficult to talk about since we lost him. I think everything that we did last year paid a wonderful tribute to these men. And as I say at the end of the article that I wrote for the Intelligencer, may we never forget them.
That's a great way to end this discussion, for sure. We would like to thank you, Joey, for coming on here and talking about the Benwood Mine Disaster, giving us a bigger perspective, a better understanding, as well as a personal attachment to it. Talk about your family. Talk about how if this disaster didn't happen, you would be here. And a lot of people wouldn't be here. We thank you, Joey, and everyone will appreciate that work that you've done for this disaster.
I thank you, Tanner, for having me as your first guest, your inaugural podcast, and Trent for being a part of this. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you all for tuning in, and we're going to do some more podcasts in the future, more guests, and just talking about Marshall County, any significant events. And if you would like to be part of this podcast, please contact the Marshall County Historical Society and let us know what you would like to talk about. Thank you very much. My name is Tanner Skim.
I'm Trent Dayton.
I'm Joey Tellitocci.
And this was Marshall County Memoirs.